Thank you, Dan, for wrapping up the session. We'll now proceed with the agenda and launch the Emerging Markets Institute annual report. To provide a bit of history of the report, it was launched in 2016. The report is aimed to contribute to the understanding of the emerging markets and their home economies. This year, the report takes a look back at the past decade and reviews some of the corporate characteristics of emerging markets, multinationals, and how they've evolved over time. Now, with the COVID crisis, the report also explores some of the consequences for the markets and the global economy as a whole. Noted contributions come from the EMNet OECD of Development, the International Finance Corporation, the UN Conference of Trade and Development, the members of the Emerging Markets Research Network, and of the Advisory Faculty Board. I'm very excited right now to share with you that this segment of the conference will be moderated by Momina Ajasuddin. To share a bit about her background, she's the global head of microfinance for the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank. Momina brings over 25 years of investment transaction experience in financial services, microfinance, and manufacturing sectors in over 60 countries across the globe. Please join me in welcoming Momina.
Thank you so much, Mariana. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you virtually this year. Last year, we were all there in person. And actually, I was thinking that the downside for us is that we don't get to meet all the students this year, which was an exciting part of this conference. Nevertheless, I'm delighted to participate in this panel. And we'll have a round of panelists: Alicia Garcia Herrero, who's from Natexis, the Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natexis, James Zahn, who's the Director of Investment and Enterprise at the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and Lorenzo Pavone, who's the Deputy Head of the Network's Partnership and Gender Division at the OECD. So just to kick off, I'm wearing a dual hat, moderating as well as presenting a little bit. I think this report is really interesting in the sense that it captures the last decade of what has been happening in emerging markets from various perspectives, whether it's policy or practitioners, as well as what the impact would be. So obviously, emerging markets have changed significantly over the last decade. There's been overall a positive view in terms of investment, growth, poverty reduction, and global business. But we're increasingly also seeing a digital divide between various regions. When I think of my day job, we work a lot on financial inclusion, and there's still 1.7 billion people who are unbanked. Latest World Bank estimates also in COVID suggest that there'll be 150 million people who will be going into poverty as a result of the pandemic. And there are 3.9 billion people who do not have access to digitalization. So the previous panel was really fascinating. This panel, I think, will build on what we were talking about in the last panel. How can digitalization be used to move things forward? And I think the panelists will talk about different aspects of this, whether it's the recent flows of capital going into this, or Lorenzo talking about digitalization, or myself in terms of financial inclusion. I think it's very clear, and I think the previous panel focused on that digital enabled, our future will be digitally enabled. I mean, the WeBank example or examples in China really show the new opportunities for digital finance to accelerate, and actually COVID is accelerating that much more. So from where I sit at IFC, what the title of the chapter was Financial Inclusion, Going Digital to Meet Customer Needs. And we've been looking at various players. We obviously invest a lot in this space. I mean, we have over 20 billion invested, and we had an emergency relief package of 8 billion to work with many of our clients to transform the way that they're working, even in the financial sector, to be more digitally enabled. I think this crisis also offers an opportunity to develop a lot of digital banking, savings and credit products, and to digitize supply chains and merchant payments that serve the base of the pyramid. So in short, I think, I won't go into more detail on the chapter. I mean, please read it. There are many examples of IFC projects or companies that we've helped create, like Bcash in Bangladesh. We even have a lot in China with Ant and others in terms of advancing financial inclusion. it would be interesting to see what kind of private sector solutions come up in this space in the next few years. And I'm looking actually directly at each one of you at the Cornell Business School, the students, to be able to produce some of these innovative solutions going ahead. So with that, I mean, framing, I'd just like to hand over, I'm not sure whether Alicia is online, but she had prepared a video. Alicia is the chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natexis, but also wears different hats, is also the adjunct professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So Lourdes, if we'd like to play the video or...
Yeah, Mark will play the video. Mark, could you please play her video because she's now in Hong Kong and it's very late for her. Let's go ahead.
All right.
So please go ahead and play it. The sound is missing. I don't know. Sometimes there are problems playing videos in Zoom. So why don't we, I would suggest Anne and I go ahead and present the report, and then we see if the problems with the video subside, and then we can do it. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Alicia. Let's see. Okay, so then I'm going to start sharing the screen with a few slides presenting the 5th EMI report that my colleague Anne Miru, formerly at UNCTAD, and myself wrote. First of all, I wanted to say that this is a major effort, and because this is the 5th one, and during this year, and that was part of the previous panels, the rise of China. So very related to these 5 EMI reports that we have. First, the China surge with a very telling picture of the opening of the enlargement of the Panama Canal. And the first boat was COSCO, a Chinese one. So China, South-South, a lot of this conversation was, this was commented in the previous panel. Then the next one, emerging multinationals in a changing world. Then this third one, reshaping globalization, how, when I ask my students in my class, is globalization over? The students from emerging markets say no, globalization is powerful. And we heard data from the president of the New Development Bank, Marcos Troyo, saying how much, for instance, trade from Brazil and Bangladesh, Brazil and India, Brazil and China has grown much more than the trade with G7 countries. So how the globalization is being reshaped from emerging markets. Then 2019, in the middle of the trade war, constructive engagement. In the 2020, 10 years that changed the emerging markets. And then the book that we published last year in December. So before I start, this is the result of Anne and I talking to each other very often about the report and working together, but definitely the EMI research team that this year is even bigger, led by Daniel Dos Anjos. Most of the graphs are his, and he's the one who says maybe we can look at this data from this different angle. Thank you very much, Daniel. Vinita Pachava, who was instrumental for the data on M&A, and let me tell you, it takes hours to compile the data and to get the data. Claudia Kokoska, who was excellent with the compiling comparisons in price, and I'll mention them today. Then Mihika Bajate and Andrew Lim, who came with this excellent ranking. First time that we rank emerging markets and we compare among each other. Britika, Padney, Megan Agavirneni, who did a lot of the EMI, what we call short descriptions of companies and institutions. Tyler Bodson with many ideas about debt, Daniel Andrade, Javier Montenegro, Soraya Quiroga, and last but not least, Judith Lopez and Jennifer Lehman, who this year, Jennifer is not with us anymore, but she has been with Judith instrumental to make this product a little bit more coherent and giving us ideas on how to move forward. Thank you all. Also, because this is the 5th edition, we have Momina, who just is moderating the panel, contributing, Beneta, Andonova, and also the other person is Andres Alvarado from Uniandes. These are part of the Emerging Multinationals Research Network. We wanted a contribution from an EMI fellow, and we have Manisha Banwal. And also we wanted a contribution from the EMI Advisory Council. So Dennis Huang has a contribution. Then from the Emerging Multinationals Research Network, Anabela Davila, Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. From China, Li Mingchen, Wuhan University, and also to Zhao Zhuang from CASTED, the research center from the Ministry of Technology in China, who contributed. And then Amadeo Genzana from the Casa Asia. And very important, very grateful to Lorenzo Pavone from OECD Development Center, who is here with us and has collaborated in every single report. And we have a very productive collaboration. And also James Zhang, UNCTAD in Switzerland, and Mike Peng is here says UT Dallas. So thank you all. So in the report, we look both at the markets, at the countries, and Anne will present that part, and also at emerging multinationals. So here we see the surge in the last decade. And so from crisis to crisis, from the global financial crisis to the great lockdown crisis, companies from China have grown in a very rapid way, 40 in the global 500 to overpassing US this year, 124, while the US 121. Most countries have lost numbers, definitely US, who has gone from 140 to 121, but also other European countries as well. And here we see that South Korea has also been instrumental in supporting their own national champions and has been present over there. Brazil, India, Mexico, and Russia, who have companies in the global 500. This tremendous growth is reflected also in the rankings of the different industries. And we mentioned some here: banks, mining, metals, petroleum refining, and insurance. Insurance, we have Ping An, out of completely unknown till recently, and we were very lucky to have the CEO of Ping An, Jessica Tan, writing the preface for the book, The Rise of Chinese Multinationals. And we had the opportunity to learn much more about a company that is using AI to process the claims in hours. And as you know, all of us suffer when we submit a claim to an insurance company, how long it takes to be processed. But definitely in banks, it's quite amazing how 4 out of the 5 biggest banks in the world are Chinese. But we see these moving numbers. Saudi Aramco, we know, biggest company in mining, crude and oil. So they also here, we classify in red Chinese companies from Global 500, in blue US companies, how the state, and that is often mentioned in the press when we read about it, how is very present. But this is not only China, it's also Europe, and it's also many emerging markets. So I just mentioned Pemex or Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco went public, but still is majority state-owned. So this role of governments is everywhere, definitely in China. So 66 of the companies of China in Fortune Global 500 are either state-owned or state-owned and public, versus 1%, it was the postal office from the US. and most of them are only public in the US, 89%. The role of stock markets in the US is prevalent, and we have quite a bit of data in the report regarding that. So how this growth has taken place. So the growth has taken place in the case of China and other companies through a persistent business model that was with low prices. Low prices, why low prices? First, because the purchasing power of the citizens of emerging markets is much lower, even in China today, than the purchasing power of clients in G7 countries. That's number one. Second, because these companies have become, over the years, very efficient. And third, because of the lack of branding. In many cases, I mentioned Ping An right now, but so number one insurance company in the world that many of us didn't know, even myself, that we are supposed to be experts. Till recently, till about 2 years ago, we had never heard about this company. So branding is not there. And I would say branding is in China or in Southeast Asia, but not in other countries. So we did this exercise, and the exercise has been done for the last 3 years in the book. Every year we compared prices of products and services, the same category. If we look at airlines, the price of an economy ticket or a business ticket from New York to Bangalore or New York to Shanghai. From US companies and Indian companies or Chinese companies. And also prices of desktops, laptops, smartphones across the board. Chinese companies and emerging market multinationals companies across the board have always offering at lower prices. This was a complicated exercise. But this is changing. This is changing, and I'm going to show you this data right now. So we compare the prices of the 5 to 10 companies that have the highest market share. In smartphones, interestingly enough, one of the most technologically advanced products today, and sophisticated and complicated to manufacture, of the 10 biggest companies by market share, only one, Apple, is an American company. The rest are either Korean, the leader, Samsung, even today, or Chinese, which is very interesting. So we could look at white goods. The rise of Haier has wiped out the market. So we have very few companies that can compete with this systematic strategy. In business schools, we tell the students, please maximize the willingness to pay of the client. And that is a strategy that we push, and we say that's the best strategy. While emerging multinational companies balance this and say, you know what, this is what we can do at this price. So another very interesting situation is Huawei. As you know, Huawei is the target of the technology and trade war. And Huawei, during this trade war, there is not bad publicity. So Huawei managed to move from number 3 to number 2. In some months, Huawei has been the leader globally in terms of market share. So this year we could not compare prices of Huawei because Huawei is not sold in the US except for some second-hand models. So we compared prices in the US market and the UK market. The most expensive phone and the cheapest phone. Samsung and Huawei are leaders in price, and also because Samsung, you have seen the ads, have launched this folding phone that is really a wonder, and Huawei is following with these folding phones. And this strategy is forcing Apple to launch products at a cheaper price, while Apple's strategy had always been to be leader in terms of price. And of course, Apple is the company that captures most of the profits. Also, this strategy is this is happening across many products. We have now TVs that are manufactured in the US and a much lower price points. So this is having a revolution. It's very disruptive in the terms of business. And then, as I was saying, in the top 500 brands, so we see a push of having in blue the number of companies, the number of brands that capture the highest ranked brands in the world. And we see China from 4% going up to 14%. And the number of US companies has also grown in terms of brand, but the number of G7 without the US has gone down. So this is a very important, and then, okay, the last reason why Chinese products are cheaper in the market is because labor cost, in spite of all the rhetoric and all the press saying that Chinese labor costs are going up, are still very low. So here we compare China, Brazil, Mexico, and India. Guess what? China, yes, the labor cost is going up a little bit, and here we have the data. So we compare a minimum wages, price of gasoline in orange, and price of electricity. That the three of them represent like 75–80% of the cost of any product. So China is still over there. But what happens as well is that the mean salary, so these lower prices are across the board. So we compared here the salary, the average salary of a CEO of a 350 listed firm in the US, 21 million, versus the 100 biggest listed firms in China, and we see that the difference is very important. Having said that, labor cost is not the only thing, because productivity is very important. And we see Germany or even Korea or Japan competing in cars, in smartphones, we saw Samsung, with higher labor cost for a number of reasons. One, because productivity per hour is higher, and also because robotization of manufacturing value chains that allows countries definitely to compete with other countries. Germany is still a major, and needless to say the US, major trade powerhouses in the world. Okay, then these companies are going global. Here we compare announced FDI greenfield projects since 2003–2019. US in blue, China is red. So the going global started 10 years ago, but in full after 2012. And here we are, China is number 2. But we have also Russia, India, Malaysia, Thailand, Latin America much less, but definitely important in terms of going greenfield. Greenfield, we see that is a very important strategy for emerging markets. And also, there is a lot of discussion in previous panel, in every panel, in the previous 2 panels, about global value chains, how we are going to consider and from outsourcing to nearshoring to homeshoring. And is it going to be easy? It's going to happen relatively soon. It's not going to be that easy. Here you have a lot of data, and we see that the main target of Chinese investments, the main target is US. Number 2, India, in spite of all the rhetoric, in the last 10 years. And also, the main source of investments as a country, in, again, greenfield announced investments, is the US. If we look at the other side, US, China is the main target, and also the main source of investments in the US. Is it going to change? So we analyzed year by year until 2018. 2018 was a record year. the numbers went down. And in terms of trade, as we know, since 2019, Mexico has taken over as the most important trade partner of the US, overtaking China. So I believe, or we believe, that remains to be seen, because both economies are very intertwined, as the data shows. And here, M&A. In M&A, this is a game for the big guys, for the big countries, for the big companies. And here we don't see emerging markets, but China and Korea. The rest have very limited activity in international M&A. In the table below, so the table upstairs, the table up, not upstairs, China started with 0%. It positioned itself in 2016. 2016 was an anomaly, I would say, because 2016 was the year that it was Syngenta was acquired. But definitely important player, mainly after 2010, less so last year. And here we compare where they go, and they go a lot to Europe, US definitely a lot to Europe in yellow, but also China. And overall, Europe is as a region, so as a country, US is the main target of Chinese M&A activity, but as a region, Europe is bigger. Okay, and then here again, we see a dichotomy of the motivations why Chinese companies or emerging multinationals and US or American or European multinationals go abroad. So initially, the US and American in general, European companies went abroad because of looking for efficiencies and growth, while initially Chinese companies were looking for natural resources. So target countries are different, and also knowledge. So they learned a lot, and we see how they build the international expertise in a circular way. Okay, and then I'll pass the baton to Anne, who will continue. Anne, you are in mute.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for attending this session. I will then follow up what Lourdes has been basically explaining or exposing. And just to put it in the overall context of the report, the first part of the report looks at how companies have evolved. And the second part put the kind of, if you want, macro environment, because obviously the rise of emerging market multinationals reflects the growth of their respective economies. And since the report looks at the 10 years back, actually when we began the report in November 2019, we thought, okay, we will do, basically we will look at what has been happening, and then we could project in the light of anticipation. But suddenly when the crisis arrived, everything was disrupted, and we decided to add another chapter trying to explore what could be some of the consequences of the crisis on emerging markets. Now, Lourdes, are you basically operating the, okay,
yes,
thank you.
Yes,
okay, thank you very much. So basically, first chapters, the 10 years, how have they changed emerging market? First thing, I must say that we are zooming only on some elements because it's very, very wide. But basically, we say that it is a decade of growth and poverty reduction overall, a decade of progress for emerging market. And I will explain why overall. But the first thing is that if we look at the weight and influence of emerging economies in the world, we see basically that emerging economies nowadays are accounting for about half of global GDP. We do that, we have created a group of 20 top emerging economies that we use to illustrate the phenomenon of rising emerging market multinational. And on this basis, these 20 economies, which are basically among the largest, they're accounting for about a third of GDP, as I said at the beginning of the decade, and now about half. Progress in poverty reduction definitely less marked than the decade before, but still quite important, including in Latin America. But a divide, and that's what I said overall, because Asia for the whole decade grew at an average of 6% for our emerging economy, and that's an average, obviously China being ahead. And then Latin America really falling behind, especially in the second half of the decade. So overall, a good decade for most of the emerging economies, with, as we said, a growing divide between Asia and the rest. Also, from the point of view of global trade and investment, increasing role in both. And what is very interesting for this particular decade is that it's really in the field of outward investment that there is a big difference. Here you have the flows of outward FDI from the E20 emerging economies, and you can see how significantly they have increased, especially since the global financial crisis. And actually nowadays, outflows from emerging economies basically account for more than 13%. That was around 12, 13 a decade ago. So substantial difference. Rising in global business, definitely Lourdes has shown that in her presentation, and we have a lot of case studies in the report to illustrate very concretely what has been happening. But one of the issues where we like to zoom in is the issue of technology and innovation. I will come back to that a little later. So we said a decade of change, a decade of progress, a decade of change because of growth, poverty reduction, role in global trade and investment, in global business, in technology, and also from a geopolitical point of view, a decade of change in soft power, largely because of the creation of two development banks by emerging markets and led by them in terms of power and deciding power, the new development bank, the so-called Bank of the BRICS, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where China, for instance, has about a quarter of the voting shares, far behind any other. And overall, all emerging economies have the leadership and the decision-making power in this bank, which actually operate all over the world. And finally, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also another tool of influence. I won't go into the detail, that would take us quite long, but I would like to zoom on the innovation and technology. By the way, yesterday, we launched another book where Lourdes and myself as the editor and a colleague from the Emerging Market Research Network. And the book is about innovation from and in emerging economy. And the point that we want also to emphasize in the report is that the change in the global innovation and technology landscape over the past 10 years. It's really, it's really amazing, both in terms of global data, but also if we think ourselves about the technical prowess of some Chinese development in the space area, for instance, or in the electricity area, or Korea, India launching satellites. India is actually moving quite ahead on space. So this is a reflection of the changes which has been taking place in technology catching up in emerging economies. We have two metrics to illustrate that, among others. The first one is that we use the Global Innovation Index, which is published by WIPO, Cornell, and INSEAD. And there we see an increasing number of emerging economies in the top ranks. And interestingly, in the ranking, China is now number 14 in terms of ranking based on the input of innovation and the output. ranking 14, it was about 20 or 30, 10 years ago. And the rank is above Canada and Japan, and just below France and Israel. So it's showing how the landscape is changing. It's not only China, we also have India, Thailand, Philippines, which are in this ranking, and others. So that's an illustration. And the other illustration, being a business school, we zoom a lot on, of course, corporations. It's interesting to know that among the largest spenders, perhaps I should explain, the EU is publishing almost every year information about the largest research and development spenders company in the world. It's called the EU scoreboard. 10 years ago, there was about 3–4% of emerging firms in this ranking of the largest spenders. Nowadays, that is 10 years later, we have about a quarter which are from emerging economy. Of course, again, we have Korea. Of course, again, we have China, but we also have India, for instance. Interestingly, we don't have many Latin American firms. So that's, we have zoomed on that as a distinctive feature of the past decade for emerging economies. Now, another point that we have developed, we said, okay, it's good to look at GDP growth, but it's not really fair for some of the countries which are at the lower level of development, because they may have done a lot in terms of development, but it's not reflected. They are not the big name. They don't have necessarily the higher GDP growth. So we have constructed, and I will explain a little later, a ranking among the E20, we just wanted to highlight interesting situation. And I must say that this ranking has been done, as Lourdes has explained a moment ago, in particular by 2 persons from the EMI research team, Mihika Bajate and Andrew Lim. They are really at the origin of this particular ranking. And it's based on GDP growth, yes, but we wanted to reflect technical progress, and we needed a handy and available and coherent metrics. So we use mobile penetration, information published by ITU. And we also wanted to illustrate the social progress to show the real achievement of some economies over the decade. So we use the Human Development Index published by UNDP. And on the right, you have a listing. And in the first ranks, okay, you have China because of the huge GDP growth, but you have countries like Bangladesh, for instance, which is a very interesting case. It used to be in the low-income category, and now it's moving up the ladder according to the UNDP. Same thing for the Philippines. So we explain that, we developed that point in the report, but our idea is that to look at what really has been happening, it's important to mix the GDP growth with the technical progress, the social progress, and really to look at what has been happening within country to have a better idea of the real progress which has been taking place. That's for the chapter on the trends. Next one. As I said, we had to basically change a little gear by February, March, when we realized what we had was happening, because the year 2020, de facto, it's a year of rupture. And we cannot really anticipate. There are forecasts, but they change. International organizations have published forecasts in March, then revised in June, as usual, and then revised in October. And we don't really know, because nobody really masters something which is beyond de facto the control of human beings and even policies. It's happening in the health sector, but it has consequences, dramatic consequences for growth and development. So when the decade ended, prospects were positive, and then came the COVID crisis, which is a human tragedy, as Momina has said, and it's also a global economic crisis of historic proportion. So it's basically the first pandemic of our modern ages. And as a result, it has a lot of characteristics that we do not know to handle. So what are the consequences? Emerging markets, they are definitely severely affected, even though less than initially expected. Projections were very dire 6 months ago. They are still very serious, but there is a little bit of hope, I would say. Mind you, with a decline of 3.3% for emerging market in our group of 20 economy, for some countries in Asia or in Africa, where we see decline of 5-6%, net decline for a country which is growing, it's a disaster, because the starting point is already relatively low. And we have, as I said, it's better than, or it's less worse than anticipated, and less bad to some extent than developed economy, which are registering almost 6% decline. Again, division, multiplicity of situation, and that's where the crisis is reinforcing the divide. China is definitely much ahead of the others with a positive growth of about 2%, the only major economy which achieves that. But the divide is also within the group of emerging economy, almost with China versus the rest, and Asia definitely versus Latin America. The Latin America is actually the region which get the worst performance because of because of the crisis, is more than a decline of 8%, with a country like Argentina close to 10 or 11%, and Mexico 8%. So it's a real tragedy, humanly and economically, for a number of nations. And a tragedy, as I said, a human tragedy because of the poverty reduction impacts. It's definitely a setback for the Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations, since it is the first time in 20 years that there is an increase in global poverty, extreme poverty, plus 100 million people are expected to fall into extreme poverty. So first, macroeconomic global picture, definitely drastic impact. And also, as you can see, illustration of the impact on the capital markets. More, I would say, in the aftermath of the crisis, because as you can see from the graph on the left is the stock market index. You can see substantial a drop, a collapse basically in March, obviously, and a rebound later on. And same thing for the currency, for the exchange rates. Latin America, as usual, being more severely impacted than other country region. We have put Asia, but it's even more impacted than Africa. I will not go into the detail, but if there are questions of why the situation happened, the bottom line is that, again, it has been a blow to emerging market. To developed market also, that's another issue. We are focusing on the emerging market right now. The next slide. Okay. Another impact that we are looking at the impact just in terms of anticipation, because at the end of the day, this will affect the firms from this country. The crisis is exacerbating the debt problem. The fiscal deficit of the emerging and of the low and middle income economy is going to double to 12% in just 1 year. And it's an average. For some countries, you reach 13 or 14%. And that is huge for emerging economy, where the budgetary resources are not what they are in developed countries. So that's why there was IMF assistance, definitely, to countries approved by September. And of course, we touch upon, I would say, the case of external debt. The point here was to show that what's going to happen, I mean, how emerging economies are going to address the crisis, and what could be the potential impact on their firms. Next. To basically address the situation, what is very interesting is the efforts which have been done in basically all over the world, including in emerging and developing economies, to try to address the economic and social cost. And here we, based on the data from the IMF, we present the fiscal packages and how much they represent in terms of GDP. There is definitely a very big difference between the developed countries, and that data or figure may change a little bit, and emerging economies. But still, I mean, for a number of governments in emerging economy, this has been a major effort. And that additional also measures which have been adopted for the first time ever is that in the monetary area, the quantitative easing. So it's almost going out of traditional orthodoxy or in a number of areas. And that's a departure which is opening lots of doors for discussion, debate. I won't go into detail again about the quantitative easing. There are pros, there are cons, but for the time being, that's one way that a number of emerging economies have found in a way, or have decided to adopt to try to cushion the shock. The bottom line is that what does all that mean for globalization? And the title here should not be misinterpreted. It does not mean globalization, unfavorable environment. It means that we are moving from a globalized world, which was favorable to emerging economy precisely because their enterprise could flourish, to an external environment that is much, much less propitious. Basic data just illustrate what's happening. A fall in global merchandise trade of 9% for the year, which is not perhaps one of the highest of the past 15 years, but still very important, and a fall of 30 to 40% in global FDI, about the largest in the past 20 years. In the report, actually, we have a very, very interesting chapter on the impact of the crisis on global value chain and how it transforms, if you want, the network of multinationals. And James Zahn actually has been leading that chapter, and he will do a presentation on that. The vulnerability of companies and nations has been revealed by the crisis. It has led to protectionist trend. One of perhaps most vivid illustration is the number of regulations which have been adopted in the past 6 months to block opportunistic M&As. Actually, it's because a number of developed economies have the memories of what happened after the global financial crisis, where a number of Chinese enterprises in particular bought or saved, if you want, financially distressed companies in developed market. And then the key question, which actually is touched in James' report, is that, the impact on the global value chain. And the name of the game for the corporation now is resiliency. So it's likely to lead to a reconfiguration of global value chain, but will it be reshoring, not shoring? All this remains to be seen. But de facto is that there was a trend in the making, and the crisis is exacerbating it. So bottom line, if you want, the crisis is threatening emerging markets, amplifying trends which were already underway, the so-called deglobalization. It's also amplifying a divide which was existing among emerging markets, with China, Asia on the one hand, and Latin America lagging behind. But what is, from our point of view and point of research, is that the external environment is much less propitious to emerging market multinational than it was in the past. Emerging economies could benefit, if you want, of an open and liberalized environment that was driving their growth. And what is happening now is amplifying the setback of the past 2 years. We have an increasingly protectionist environment, and I won't go, but everybody knows the US-China trade war and the potential increasing decoupling, which many economists are talking about. So we are in a situation which is fraught with uncertainty, extremely complex, and perhaps the lesson that we have had is that in terms of international cooperation, the past few months have not been perhaps what they should have been. So for the at least the future and the immediate and the near-term year, there is a need for very tight cooperation, much more. There is a need at the economic level, but also at the sanitary level. And I will close this presentation here. And I also want to ask, not to ask, but to thank, as Lourdes said, all the colleagues which have contributed. She has listed a number of members. We also have in the report chapters on Colombia by Veneta Andonova. We have a chapter on talent competitiveness by Annabella Davila from Tech de Montero. The bottom line is that the report ends us giving a snapshot of emerging markets at a particular point in time, now after the crisis, but also looking back at what has been achieved. And we always try to have case studies and illustration, and we hope that you will enjoy reading it. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot to our contributors.
Thank you, Annie. I hope you can hear me. My internet connection is a bit unstable. So let's hand over to James, who will talk about FTC investment over the last 3 decades. This should be very interesting as it shows how global value chains are changing over time, and particularly what the implications will be for economic policy. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Omina. First of all, I wish to thank Lourdes and Anna for inviting my colleague Krishnadi and me to contribute to a chapter to this very important report. It is really our great pleasure. For this chapter, the chapter's title is GVC Transformation in the 2020s and the Implications for Emerging Economies. And for that, it's a kind of forward-looking chapter that looks into global value chains transformation and FDI, both short-term and the longer term. For the short term, we'll look at the impact of pandemic on the prospects of global FDI and FDI of the emerging markets. And for the longer term, it's more of the impact of global value chain transformation and its impact on global trade and investment landscape, and in particular for the emerging market, and what should be the kind of a new strategies for the new landscape, so to speak, for emerging markets. Now, the short-term impact on the pandemic, on the prospects of FDI. At global level, as we all know, that pandemic is a kind of triple shocks of supply, demand, and the policy. In the sense that we see now the short-term FDI prospects, that is between 2020 to 2021, is the prospect is quite bleak. The COVID-19 crisis will cause a dramatic fall in FDI. And according to our UNCTAD forecast, the global FDI is going to decrease. It is going to decline by up to 40% this year, and this is from the value of $1.54 trillion of 2019, and this will bring the global FDI below $1 trillion, and this is the first time since 2005 that global FDI falls into such a low level. And FDI is projected to decrease by another 5 to 10% next year. And the initial recovery could be only in 2022. And this is quite different from the forecast on global GDP and the trade. And even for stock market that Anne showed a moment ago, that they all show the kind of possible V shape of recovery, while in terms of global FDI, it could be kind of a U shape of recovery, and we see it. And when the rebound started in 2022, it could be only driven by a kind of restructuring for resilience or replenishment of capital stock, and this kind of recovery driven by the global economy. It won't be much of really new investment, so to speak. So that's we see a kind of slow recovery. Now, with respect to the emerging markets, as an author, that we see the impact is quite strong for the emerging 20. That is, according to the definition of the report, the 20 countries. Overall, we see that the impact is everywhere severe, but it varies among the emerging markets. For some, like China and several Southeast Asian countries, that appear to be weathering the storm relatively better for the time being. That is according to our statistics of the first half of this year. Last week, I launched our Global Investment Trends Monitor. That is, we normally submit it to G20 periodically. That developing countries as a whole suffered from 16% of decline, while for developed countries, it is close to 70%. I'm talking about the major developed economies. For US, it was 61% of decline for the first half of the year. For Europe, it was the lowest ever we recorded over the past 3 decades, as we have the data. But interestingly, for East and Southeast Asian countries, that the decline was only 12%. But having said that, if we look at the greenfield announced deals and also the project financing of developing economies, and we see a kind of decline of 49%. So that's the indicator for the investment flows, actual investment flows in the near future. So that shows that the storm is continuing to be bigger. It will continue and it will be bigger. That's what we see. And coming back to the emerging markets, we see that those from Latin America that would suffer more, and also from transition economies. So in terms of the emerging 20, they will weather the storm differently. And our assessment is based on kind of 2 major factors. One is that looking at the overall developing countries inflows in prospect, and based on that to come up with the assessment, as we know that the emerging 20 account for close to 70% of the FDI flows annually. So based on our model of forecasting for developing countries, that's up to 40% of the decline for this year. So we see for the emerging 20, it'll be in a similar level. But having said that, I would say that the emerging economies from Asia may lead global FDI recovery. So it'll be the leaders in that, while the emerging economies from Latin America and the transition economies, they'll be lagging behind the global FDI recovery. They suffered more in that sense. So that's our forecast regarding the emerging markets. But I would like to put a positive note on the short-term trends. In a sense, despite the drastic decline, FDI will continue to be an important source of external financing for productive sectors for the emerging 20, and it will play an important role in the economic development. And this can be demonstrated by the significant share of FDI flows in the stock as a share of the gross fixed capital formation and GDP, respectively. And such a share is roughly about 10%. It's higher than the developing countries' average. So this is the short-term prospects of FDI flows at global level and to the emerging markets. Now, let me come to the longer term impact. And this impact, I would say, is far reaching and goes beyond the pandemic. In fact, in our World Mass report at UNTAD, that we reviewed the past 30 years of international production system and the growth of global value chains. For the last 3 decades, international production saw 2 decades of rapid growth, followed by 1 of stagnation. And indeed, in the 2010s, the flows of cross-border investment in physical productive assets stopped growing, and expansion of trade slowed down, and the GVC trade declined. And that we can show from our statistics, according to our data, that in the 1990s, for example, FDI annual growth rate was 15%. And in the 2020s, it was 8%, while the gets to 2010s, the FDI flows on annual growth basis was 0.5%. In terms of trade, it's the similar picture that in the 1990s, trade growth was roughly about 6.2%, and in the 20s was higher. On average, it was 9%. When it gets to 2010s, it was only 2.7%. That shows the slowdown of globalization. So basically, the 2010s were only the quiet before the storm, and the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic arrives on top of existing challenges that we see to the international production system or the global value chains. That's rising from the new industrial revolution, the growing economic nationalism, and the sustainability imperative. So in fact, we predict that the decade of 2030s is likely to prove a decade of transformation of international production. And for that, in the UN World Investment Report, that we analyzed these 4 mega trends that drive the global value chain transformation through 3 dimensions via 4 trajectories. 3 dimensions meaning the length of the value chains, the location of the value added, and the governance of the value chains. And then 4 trajectories then these are the reshoring, diversification, regionalization, replication. Although that the different trajectories show that they expect the transformation of international production or global value chain, that they may not be kind of unidirectional, but the overall direction of the transformation can be foreseen. That we come up with 10 kind of mega implications of the transformation. First, the global value chain will be shorter and less fragmented. The second is that there will be more concentrated value added. So it'd be widely geographically spread, but more concentrated. And that's due to a kind of replication and distributed manufacturing, and also partly because of the reshoring, nearshoring. And the third, the direction is a kind of a more platform-driven and asset-light value chain governance. So that's the kind of a possibility of, and it is already a trend, that platform firms taking over as the lead firms of the traditional multinationals. The fourth direction is kind of a shift from global to regional and the sub-regional value chains. And that's due to the kind of the changing pattern of global economic governance, the rise of trade and investment protectionism, and also many other factors. Another trend is kind of downward pressure on global efficiency-seeking FDI in favor of regional market-seeking FDI. And the sixth is the downward pressure on global trade in intermediary goods and with less on trade in final products. These are all because of the transformation of global value chain and due to the other factors I mentioned earlier. There will be also a shift in some industries from large-scale investment to smaller-scale distributed manufacturing, and that's related to kind of AI-driven manufacturing and also 3D printing and the nearshoring, which I talked about early, that will change the scale of the manufacturing due to the technological revolution. And then there could be a continued and continued growth and fragmentation of service value chains. So we expect that on the one hand, the manufacturing value chain will get shorter and less fragmented, but services value chain will get longer and more fragmented. So we'll see more offshoring, more kind of allocation of outward investment, and due to the kind of servitization of the manufacturing. Another trend is kind of resilient and the national security-driven type of value chain diversification. That is obvious if you've seen the trend. Last but not least is the shift from global value chain driven investment to cross-border investment in infrastructure, domestic services, and green and blue economies driven by the sustainability imperative. That includes sustainable development goal driven type of investment due to the policy changes. So implication-wise for emerging market, we see the challenges and opportunities. Challenges that includes the increase of divestment, relocation, and investment diversion, and the shrinking pool of efficiency-seeking investment that will intensify the competition for FDI. Value capture in GVCs and the development based on vertical specialization will become more difficult. Industrial infrastructure built for a world of GVCs that a large number of developing countries, particularly in East and Southeast Asian countries, that for this type of growth model, that will be a kind of there will be a kind of diminishing return to that kind of efforts. And then lastly, the challenge relate to the change in locational determinants of investment. And this will negatively impact on the chances of emerging markets to attract multinational operations. Opportunity-wise, we see there's a kind of great potential for attracting investors looking for diversified supply bases and building redundancies and resilience. That's more for opportunities of other emerging markets other than Southeast Asian countries. Another opportunity is the pool of regional market-seeking investment that will increase, and opportunities for shorter value chains that will bring more investment in distributed manufacturing and the final goods production with broader industrial bases and capacities. So clustering matters. And another one is the digital infrastructure and the platforms will enable new applications and the services and improve bottom-up access to global value chains. And of course, the sustainability imperative will lead to more green and blue investment and value chains in emerging markets. So overall, all these requires a kind of change in the GVC development path and the mind shift. For example, there's a kind of shift of the focus on export-oriented efficiency-seeking investment in narrowly specialized GVC segments. That's the kind of strategy for a number of developing countries. We need to shift to a broader export-led strategy that extends to investment in production for regional markets and for industrial clustering. There should be a shift from cost-based competition for single location to a kind of competition for diversified investment based on flexibility and resilience, and a shift from prioritizing large-scale industrial investors with a big infrastructure to kind of making rooms for small-scale manufacturing facilities and services, that's learning infrastructure. What I'm talking about is more of strategy shifting for the decade to come, not just talking about this year and next. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. And this was very interesting in terms of, the backward-looking analysis as well as the implications for the future. So over to you, Lorenzo. You have the unfortunate task of focusing on leveraging technology and what the new technologies that can be used to leverage, coming out of this pandemic. And as younger technology. More technology, you can also be brief, use brevity, perhaps. We have about 10 minutes, like 5 to 10 minutes. Just in the interest of time, Alicia, who was with us in spirit and through a YouTube video, but we're having technical issues. So her video will be uploaded. It'll be in the YouTube's EMI. So please do take a look at that after this session. Thanks. Over to you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Momina. And please, tell me when I have a couple of minutes if I go too long. I'm conscious of time. I spare the thank yous to everyone. It's a good pleasure to be here. I'm thanking everyone for the invitations, particularly and Lourdes for our great cooperation. But I go straight to the point because I don't have that much time. What I would like to talk today is a bit give an overview of what happened in the past 10 years in the digital world and how the digitalization has changed over the past decade, and also a little bit how the chapter that we wrote for the report explores basically how the private sector can contribute to accelerating the digital transformation and support recovery. And in particular, what are the reforms that the companies think are the most relevant to achieve that. This comes from discussions with the companies that we have in our network, the Emerging Markets Network. I would like to start by a quick sort of overview of how now actually we are using digitalization, how actually in this situation of the COVID crisis, digital technology actually helped us work. And in a way, we can say that without digitalization, the impact of the COVID pandemic might have been much worse. For example, because of digital tools, in the US, we calculated that 34% of employees, so 1 out of 3, were able to switch to telework in April 2020. Avoiding therefore disruptions in their activities. At UCD also we checked, we calculated that basically there's an estimation approximately 1/3 of businesses with online operations managed to actually increase their sales last April in spite of the COVID crisis and the lockdowns. Ourselves at the OECD went 100% teleworking in March, and after that we have been doing it for the rest of the year. I personally haven't been in the office since March. So this tells you how digital technologies actually helped us survive a bit the crisis. And imagine if the crisis happened 10 years ago, how would it be more difficult to basically operate the way we did. I would like to now see if I can share with you a quick presentation. It's really a few slides. Okay, there you go. So here you can see the mobile market share in 2010. The mobile vendor market share worldwide, 2010. So you can see that we have Nokia, Apple, RIM, Sony, Samsung, names that are familiar. If we now go to this year, 2020, let's see what happens. Well, first of all, 3 of these companies disappear. Nokia, Sony, and RIM are no longer there. Sony and Nokia, they accounted for 44% of the market share in 2010. Now it's 1.6%. RIM no longer exists. now it's called directly BlackBerry. RIM is the company that produced BlackBerry, and they don't do smartphones anymore. Now they focused on business services, business IT software services. The second point is in line with what Lourdes and Anne mentioned. We have now 3 Chinese companies that replaced the 3 that I just mentioned: Huawei, Xiaomi, which, by the way, was founded in 2010, when I presented the first slide in 2010. That context, Xiaomi was born, and Oppo. The other point I wanted to highlight is, if you look at 2010 and 2020, you can see the others column is now more than 20%. It used to be around 2%. So the market has a much large number of players. So we know that the digital platforms are basically very much concentrated in the hand of few players, but the manufacturers of mobile phones and smartphones now are a much large number of competitors. So I can stop here the sharing, and basically what we can say here is that many things have changed, and we saw it already. In terms of the context, mobile technology upgraded from 3G to 4G networks. And was this very important? Yes, because with 3G, basically, we were able to do calls, texts, and connect to internet at a decent speed. But now with 4G, we can go 10 times faster. And just to give you a perspective, this reduced the download time for a film that is, let's say, 800 megabytes. Previously 5 hours, now 43 seconds. Now, this also brought a change in the way we use technologies, and particularly users now are going away from their desktops, and they try to use more and more smartphones to do their activities. So as a result, now we have the possibility to stream music and videos, shop on e-commerce sites, and so use social media, and all done through our smartphones. Today, almost 5 billion of people of phone users exist around the world. So I think around 60% of the world population has access to phone and uses smartphones. Daily time spent online went from 30 minutes in 2011 to more than 2 hours in 2009. Whereas, for example, the amount of time I used on desktop, it was stable and actually declined recently. By 2022, the OECD estimates that 3 devices per person will be connected around the globe. And connection means phones are connected, but also cars, houses, healthcare devices will be connected. And more so digital technologies will be part of our daily life. If I want to say something about emerging markets, the e-commerce in Latin America went from virtually nothing in 1999 to now over 70, 80 billion of US dollars. Speaking always about users, there's an interesting aspect of the outbreak on social media. In the age of the desktop computers, let's say 10 years ago, we were using social medias, basically Facebook, MySpace, for those that are more into music. It was a log of what happened in the past, a collection of experiences uploaded to show the others some information. Now social media shift to an instant broadcast of what's happening now. So they're not focusing on the past, they're focusing on the present. Not to mention that the number of global users increased 3 times, from less than 1 billion to now around 3 billion of people. Oh, everything is good? Well, no. There are a number of social groups that have not benefited from everything that I said, particularly in rural areas. In OECD countries, around 56% of rural households have access to high-speed internet, which means half of them don't. In comparison, 85% of people in urban areas have access to high-speed internet. In sub-Saharan Africa, only 23% of the population has access to internet mobile internet. And actually, this is very much low broadband. In Latin America, there is also an issue of disparities between 75% of the richest population that use internet and only 37% of the poorest population. So more, let's say, 3/4 of the richest versus 1/3. And in Southeast Asia, less than 1% of people in countries like Cambodia, Laos, or Myanmar actually have access to fixed broadband networks. Now, with this situation, how can the private sector actually contribute to accelerating the digital transformation? There are some policies that can play an important role in support of the development of the digital economies. It's something that the companies ask when they talk in forums and also with us in Mnet. And in particular, they are focusing on three pillars: invest in connectivity, invest in human capital, and prepare new regulations that cover a number of topics like trade and investment, cybersecurity, online payments, data protection, service, privacy, that can be relevant for them to invest more and support economic benefit from the digitalization. So I'm going to just say a few words about these three aspects, and then I will stop here. Invest in connectivity. In particular, we already saw that we need to focus, this is particularly relevant in emerging markets in rural areas, and to help the most disadvantaged groups basically have internet, have high speed, and be able to benefit from all the advantages that the digital technologies are bringing. High-speed internet connection is an issue. It's across the globe. There are parts of the world, obviously, particularly in the most developed countries, where it's 4G and high-speed internet connection is widespread, but there is a need to invest more in infrastructure to also allow the transition to soon the 5G, and also hard infrastructure. To give an example, e-commerce obviously is good for because you can order everything from your mobile phone, but then someone needs to bring the package, whatever you order, to your house. So you still need to invest in the hard infrastructure, in the transport system, and the logistics to make sure that whatever you order arrives. And this, particularly, for example, in Africa and Latin America, is still an important issue. Invest in human capital.
Lorenzo, I'm really sorry, but time is going up. So if you could wrap up, that would be.
I wrap up.
Great. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
In human capital, I mean, I don't have to say that much. Everybody knows that we need to reduce the digital divides, particularly on education, gender, income, and geographies. And finally, on regulatory frameworks, I just wanted to highlight that China, India, and Indonesia have now more trade restrictions in telecommunication services than all other countries in the OECD Digital Service Trade Restrictiveness Index, which basically covers G20 plus. So we have China, India, okay, they are going up, but the regulatory framework is still very much restricted for telecommunication services, which impacts also investments. The last point is policies are also important for blockchains, big data, and artificial intelligence. And we need to design regulations that help reduce the perceived investment risk of investors. That when they invest, they need to make sure that investments are long-term. So you need to have a political situation and economic situation in countries that allow for companies to feel that this is a place where they want to invest. And sometimes it's not the case when there is a lot of volatility perceived also in the political system. And the law enforcement on the rule of law is not clear. I will stop here and give the floor back to Momina. If you want to know more, I'd be happy to answer questions another time.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. We have had a collaboration with the OECD DEF from day one. Momina, you want to close the panel and then pass the word to Anna?
Yes, of course. So I won't say much. I think Lourdes had shared the chapter link on at the top, ecommons.cornell.edu. It was a pleasure to be able to share I think some of the work that all of us have done as part of this exercise. It was really a pleasure to collaborate. I think for many of us, I speak for my fellow panelists as well, to collaborate with Lourdes, with Anne, and as well as the positive energy of the students who helped us, go back and forth. So thank you, and over to you, Lourdes, and hello, Dr. Andrew.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is the first presentation of many, because the idea will be presenting at the OECD DEF in January, hopefully virtually or presential, hopefully. And also we want to collaborate with IFC to present all the chapters with UNCTAD and others. So the first of many.